Good morning, and welcome to the Lightcast live analysis of the BLS Employment Situation Report. Today on June 2nd, 2023, I'm your host, Elizabeth Crowfoot, filling in for Chris Laney. And joining me are my two expert colleagues, senior economist Ron Hetrick and senior economist Rucha Van Kudre. Ron, Rucha, good to see you both this morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Great. Well, there's so much to jump into today. And Rucha, I want to get your thoughts on it. Also, if you can give us just a quick recap of what were those headline numbers and, what can we be expecting here?
Sure. So I think that, the two big numbers everyone always looks at first are unemployment and jobs gained. And I think in both cases, we were pretty surprised this morning. Everyone had kind of been expecting a bit of a slowdown. The past couple months, things have been sort of at around the 200,000 jobs added number. And instead, we had 339,000. So really much more than I think anyone was expecting. And then at the same time, I think given sort of what came out in JOLTS earlier this week with, layoffs hadn't really increased in the past couple months, we were expecting unemployment to stay relatively constant to low, maybe around 3.5%. And it actually shot up to 3.7%, which is quite a big movement and much more than we've seen in a long time. And so I think both of those things were really surprising. And it's a very interesting report, particularly when you start kind of looking in specifically at where those job gains are and where the unemployment really is moving.
Yeah. And speaking of that, Ron, what were your first impressions about these data that just came out?
My first impression was shock because I kind of guessed this one completely wrong. But that seems to be the theme of this year, right? It seems like things are happening in months that we don't exactly expect that they would. Like we thought we would see, more of a layoff effect a month or two ago, and we're starting to see it now. If you look at the unemployment gain, which was just talking about, they look at, when you look at the number of people who are unemployed, they divide it up. Like, where are these people? Why are they unemployed? Are they new entrants? Are they coming into the labor force? Are they, what's the different status? And this month we saw a pretty good increase in those people who permanently lost their jobs. So that's kind of what's driving this number up. But you do see a pretty decent amount of people jumping back into the labor force, even though the labor force participation rate was unchanged. We see a decent amount of people even joining the category of not in the labor force. So it is definitely an interesting report from that regard.
Right. And, I really want to dig into some of the industry detail as well, because like you said, that's where all the interest lies, especially this month. Rucha, what were some of the top gains or losses at that industry level?
Sure. So the top gains were sort of in more kind of areas where you expect to see some gains. So sort of the typical places where we would expect healthcare and social assistance gained about 75,000 jobs. Government gained about 56,000 jobs. And then leisure gained about 48,000 jobs. So I think none of those were too shocking particularly. I think interestingly, where we did see the biggest loss was in information, where we saw a loss of about 10,000 jobs. So, I think these are really the jobs that are kind of maybe at the lower level as we would think of. And so once you kind of dig in, it makes sense that that is actually where the jobs are being added in spite of what we hear in terms of layoffs.
And Ron, did anything catch your eye at that industry level?
A lot of things caught my eye today on this industry level. So I think first things first, we had another really nice gain in construction, and construction's up 70,000 so far this year. That's a really good sign. We've been trying to get greater housing supply onto the market. We do have a very historically low supply of houses, so it's good that construction companies are finally able to get their workers. When you look at some of these things that I think the Fed's going to be looking at, consumer goods, manufacturing, not doing well, hasn't been doing well for a while. We did get some gains in manufacturing, but it was more in autos. Well, great, because we've also had an auto supply problem this year as well. Very low inventory of autos. Non-durable goods manufacturing not doing well, but once again, looks like the consumer goods side. When we look at things like warehousing, this is another sector that was so overheated in the past 2 years that we did say would start to correct. It posts a small loss, not a big one, a small one, but it continues to kind of show that there's some erosion there, I think, as we're starting to move inventories on. And then, what Richard just pointed out, it's important to say, when you look at a number like 339, this is a huge payroll jobs gain, but this is not a number I think that's going to scare the Fed, because you do have a significant proportion of this, 30% in the private ed to healthcare side, a lot in like social assistance, that gain that you saw in government that she mentioned, a lot of that coming from local government, local ed. So these are not the things that I think scare people that, hey, you're overheating the economy because you're adding jobs to these sectors. There's other sectors that you kind of say, hey, I don't want to see the gains there because that probably means the wage pressure is going to stay. And I think to that point, we'll probably talk about that, but wages are a big part of what we're, kind of looking at right now. So there's definitely sensitivity to how we're gaining these jobs.
Yeah, and speaking of things that could potentially scare the Fed, Rucha, I wanted to ask you about those upward revisions in job gains that we saw for March and April. What do you think this tells us about the momentum that we're seeing in the labor market? And maybe, these are just one-offs or, as Ron is saying, that maybe it's not something that we should pay a lot of attention to and that, there are certain industries that we should be focusing on instead.
Yeah, so the number was revised up for the past 2 months for a total of about 93,000 additional jobs. I think if you think back to last month, it was actually the opposite, where they revised them both down, I believe. So this is definitely showing a bit stronger job gains than I think maybe we were anticipating. And I think if we didn't have these unemployment numbers, then I would be more worried for the Fed, right? Because that would say here's a lot of really strong numbers given, if you ignore sort of the heterogeneity that Rob was just discussing in the industries, right? Like on its face, it looks like a large number, and things being revised up also seems like a lot of strength. But at the same time, I think, when you really start looking at the unemployment, you actually do start to see that things are slowing down. And so I think in that sense, this actually is kind of a good report for the Fed.
Yeah, and Ron, just sort of digging into that a little bit further, just the significance of that movement upward in the unemployment rate to 3.7, like 0.3 of a percentage point is quite a big movement for the headline number. Can you explain or give us a sense of what is actually causing that movement in terms of overall labor supply? I mean, is this a good thing or a bad thing that we're seeing?
Well, I think if you're the Fed, it's a good thing. I think for everybody else, the movement down last month was a bit of a shock. So I almost want to sit there and say, I think last month was an anomaly. I think we were probably starting to head up a little bit, but for whatever reason, we had kind of an odd month. Labor force kind of went down a bit. Labor force regains those losses this month. And then you kind of look to see, well, where is it happening as well? It's really kind of odd. Once again, you look into the data, the Hispanic unemployment rate takes an enormous fall, like really comes down, plunges a lot. We do see teen unemployment going up. We see African-American unemployment going up. But there's something about that kind of talks to this, I would call it that sub $25 hour labor supply, which is that teen labor force. The fact that their unemployment rate's going up is actually speaking to the fact that, as we were thinking or hoping, there would be a kind of a surge this year. And the reason why is because we've seen wages not only go up in a lot of the industries that these people would be focused on, things like restaurants and retail. A lot of those industries have seen these wage gains. Those wage gains have not gone down, which is an indication that they're still feeling a lot of hiring pressure there. And I think it's attracting a certain group of people back in for these jobs. And the fact that we're seeing unemployment rates go up there, I think it's a great thing, because teen unemployment in particular, I've been talking about this kind of 16 to 19-year-old population. The last time we saw unemployment rates this low was like back in 1955. So we really need to free up that labor pool, because that is where a lot of the demand is coming in our economy right now.
Yeah, and Rucha, I want to stick to you or go to you about wages. Ron mentioned this. They're obviously top of mind for the Fed right now as they're trying to rein in inflation. What was that latest reading on wage gains?
So I think, so actually, before I discuss that, I just want to go back a little bit to the unemployment teen point as well. So as Ron said, it did go up overall. But one thing I thought was interesting is that it mainly went up for white teens. If you actually look at the unemployment rate for Black teens and Latino teens, it went down. The Latino teens is not surprising in the context that all of the numbers for Latino unemployment went down. But I thought the Black number was particularly interesting because it actually did go up for the over 20 for male and female. But the teens number went down. So I'm a little bit curious to see, I think, if we are seeing some sort of bifurcation in the economy and in the way people are now approaching jobs. In terms of wages, I think, wages, they went up, but sort of in those industries that Ron was mentioning, or maybe a little bit, the sub 25. And so given that, I think, that plus the fact that we are adding jobs there makes a lot of sense. And the other thing is, I think overall that number, although we are still, wages have not caught up with inflation, I think everything is still trending downwards in the right direction. And so that's another good sign for the Fed.
Yeah, definitely a good sign there. And Ron, I wanted to ask you just, as the Fed policymakers keep harping on this necessity to cool the labor market and really bring down inflation. Is it even possible to cool a labor market where we have so many demographic trends that are working against it, where consumption is still going really strong? Overall labor force participation rate hasn't recovered much since pre-pandemic times. What is your thought on all of this?
That's a really deep subject to try to cover in a short period of time. I would just say that we know that the main issue here is that we do have, an aging population that is retiring and staying retired, and that problem can't be solved. I think the question is, well, how are employers dealing with this kind of, now chronic labor shortage, especially when it comes to the lower skilled jobs, those sub $20, sub $25 an hour jobs. And what we've seen is they raise pay rates. But what we've clearly seen in the past several months is they're kind of holding now. And I think the economy is kind of adjusting to, its condition and, the shortages that we're seeing. What I think is kind of interesting right now is if you're, a higher skilled employee, or I would say a mid-skilled employee, somebody who's more in that, 50,000 to 80,000 range. I think the economy is kind of slowing up in that kind of mid range. And I think that's where you're kind of feeling maybe an effect of a slowing economy. So I think the Fed, in a sense, as they start to think about how do I weaken the economy, they kind of look into that middle level, like how can we kind of slow businesses down there? And I don't think they're thinking more of the ends, because those are hard to control, that high end worker or the really low end worker. But I think what you're seeing is, if this economy starts to turn, which I do believe, towards as this year goes on and some of the kind of uncertainty eases up, we've barely created any slack. And I keep talking about this, even getting an unemployment rate to 3.7%, you would go, hey, that's certainly what the Fed wants. I mean, Fed wanted a 4.6% unemployment rate, and this is heading in the direction that they want. But this is during a point where, during the course of this year, we were like, we've got to, this rope was so tight. We've got to put a lot of slack into this rope. And we've put very little slack in the rope. So even if the economy tries to take off, and believe me, I was shocked at this employment gain because I didn't know if we'd even have that number of people to even put to work to get that kind of a net gain. How many months can we do that? Because, the unemployment rate still is historically low. When you look at unemployment claims, they are so low. And I think we're still dealing with historically a very low number of people unemployed. So, even if the economy wants to do something, it's not going to take much to get things to overheat again. And I just don't think that there's much we can do about that. It'll literally come down to employers saying, I don't want to raise wages anymore. I'll just deal with the amount of people that I can get. But I think the days of the brutal wage battle are over.
Yeah, and Rich, I want to get your thoughts. I mean, we've been discussing, what the Fed may or may not think about this, and they're obviously meeting in a couple of weeks again to determine their interest rate policy, and they've signaled pretty clearly their intention to skip a rate hike in the coming meeting. Do you think this data is going to move any of that intention?
I don't think so. I think this really supports that. I think, after we saw the JOLTS report this week where openings shot up, which is really not what anyone was expecting, I think there was, people were worried like, oh, this is actually things heating up again, especially since, quits stayed about the same or increased a little bit and layoffs had not increased. And so I think people were a little bit worried that, maybe this is actually now turning again. But I think this report shows that we are still on track, right? And that one was lagged. So I think, what we expect to see next month is that probably layoffs will have come up a bit just to sort of account for these unemployment numbers we're seeing. And so I think, this is on the right track. And at the same time, I think, as Ron was mentioning, the Fed has always said, 4.6. And I think maybe we're getting to a point where, given that inflation is coming down, maybe not as quickly as they would like, but it is coming down and employment is slowly increasing, but the economy is still growing. I think maybe, it's time to sort of change what that bar is, right? So maybe we're going to be okay with a little bit lower unemployment rate, but if inflation is still coming down and the economy has not stopped growing, then I think that's a good place for us to be.
Great. And Ron, anything to add on that in terms of what the Fed should or should not do, or what they may or may not do?
I think that's the big question. My personal feeling is, what Richard just said is exactly where I've been, which is we live in a new reality now. Things that we used to be able to do, we can't do anymore. And I think that that's okay. I think what happened last year, going from 21 into 22, scared a lot of people. This whole great, as I called it, the great reallocation. We weren't adding a lot of people to the labor force. We were just taking the labor force we had and just paying them more and more and more. and that just got passed into product pricing. And so you saw all of these things exploding. But if you are really paying attention to what's going on right now, you'll see that pressure, that story is going away. There are still a lot of companies, especially small businesses, who are like, look, we're still really struggling to hire. But what you're not hearing is, and I've had to increase my pay here, or I'm doing this. A lot of companies are like, I'm kind of done with that. I'm going to either learn how to live with less employees. I'll take care of the ones that I have. But I think all we needed to do was just ease that pressure off of this labor force. Like, just take away that really intense, like, look, if I don't get people in here right now, I'm in huge trouble. And I don't sense that anywhere. I don't sense companies anywhere in a complete panic, like, look, we're not going to be able to get things done. Healthcare has probably been the one that's complained the most, and they had an enormous gain this month. I mean, maybe we're making progress on that front. So I'm sure for healthcare workers who have been overworked for a long time, they're probably really glad to see this. I hope that they're feeling this personally. But these are the things that we're kind of watching is, are we hearing these stories? Are we hearing this constant like crying of, look, I'm so desperate for workers, we can't meet our orders. And we're definitely not hearing that in manufacturing. We're seeing their employment numbers come down. I think we're starting to ease up on everything.
Mm-hmm. And on that note, Rucha, what are your final thoughts, your final takeaways from all of this?
I mean, I think, as I said, this was a very surprising report. And although, I think maybe if people look at it, the first pass would be, this is not great in terms of, right, like, things are very strong. But I think when you actually dig a little bit deeper, it's good in the sense that things are continuing to slow down in a way we want without, causing any real drop-offs. Right. There's no cliff we're approaching. Things are slowing down in a nice way, and the economy is still growing. So overall, I think a very positive report, particularly for the Fed.
Ron, anything to add there? What are your final takeaways?
Yeah, I completely agree. I when I first saw the number of that 339, I just was almost in shock, and I've started to go in and break it down. And I'm like, it's a very unremarkable 339. There's just nothing here to be afraid of. One of the first points that Rusha made is so critical, and that is, look, we're okay adding jobs in healthcare. We've always been adding jobs in healthcare. We're okay adding jobs in government. That usually is not an indication of really anything. Adding jobs in restaurants, well, good, because they're so worker short right now. That's perfectly fine. I think we're seeing, and even like I said, the construction gains, those are good things. These are not things to be afraid about. I don't think that, seeing the unemployment rate go up kind of adds to that whole kind of, look, this is a good report. No one should be, wow, I don't know what we're going to do going forward. We're so tight. I think it's a nice report for those who were concerned. Can we soften the economy in a way that's still kind of healthy? I think the answer is yes.
Ron, Rusha, thank you so much for your insights. And to all of our viewers, thank you for joining us for this conversation. And we will see you again next month. I'm Elizabeth Crowfoot. Go to lightcast.io to learn more.